In order to protect the world from the anomalous, the SCP Foundation has been required to make deals with some truly nightmarish groups and entities. Human sacrifices need to be made to keep threats like SCP-2845, the Deer God, and SCP-2317-K, the Devourer of Worlds, contained. They've even had to collaborate with the anomaly-murdering likes of the Global Occult Coalition. They've even needed to employ anomalous murderous psychopaths like SCP-076-2 Able in order to enhance their mobile task forces. But all of this pales in comparison to the darkest figure they've needed to deal with in the centuries of their existence: Vince McMahon. Yes, that Vince McMahon. Agents of the SCP Foundation first reach out to Mr. McMahon in the early 1980s during his rise to power at the World Wrestling Foundation, or WWF. Bear in mind, it'd still be a couple of decades before they'd be sued by the panda-loving World Wildlife Fund and need to change it to the WWE. You don't even need to be that much of a wrestling enthusiast to know that he's got a checkered past. He's a ruthless businessman to his enemies, a sometimes treacherous boss, and even doing some things we can't mention here if we want to eat this month. But in this case, he was the lesser of two evils. The SCP Foundation wanted to make a deal with him, one that would expand McMahon's wrestling empire far further than he'd ever dreamed. Wrestling before the 1990s was different than it is now. It was far from the entire industry being run largely by one huge company, with a few smaller competitors orbiting around it. Things used to be a lot more, well, cutthroat. These were the days of the territories. A large number of wrestling promotions cordoned off into their own areas, operating almost like mob families. Each operated their own stables of star wrestlers made up of faces, the heroic wrestler the audience is meant to identify with, and heels, the villainous wrestlers meant to draw heat out of the crowd. To take over or absorb these other territories, McMahon would need to not only seduce their top wrestlers over to his own promotion, he would also need to absorb their television syndication rights. Vince McMahon and the WWF didn't have that kind of money. But the SCP Foundation did. They were willing to loan some of that money to McMahon if it meant taking all of these little territories and consolidating them into his giant wrestling behemoth. One nation of wrestling under McMahon, and McMahon under the auspices of the SCP Foundation. But even Vince himself was confused by this. "Why would you guys even be interested in wrestling?" he said. "I know a scam when I see one. You better give me a reason why you'd be willing to pitch in that kind of cash, or I'm gonna kick your butts out the door you walked in through." And the best answer they could give was the honest one: to save the world. The tale of SCP-6037 started decades even before this fateful meeting. It all began with the career of Guido Bonatti, professionally known in the wrestling world as Arno Starman Valentino, a wrestler and promoter operating from 1943 until his death in 1975. Guido had the X Factor, a special something that made his performances and his promotions really connect with audiences. And this made him the perfect original vector for a fifthist anomaly intended to unravel reality itself. Before we continue, we need to add a little note on the Fifth Church, whose members are colloquially known as Fifthists. They're some of the most strange and esoteric groups of interest out there. They are responsible for everything from demonic, mind-controlling pickup artists to idealistic but doomed spacefaring Volkswagen vans. So before we delve deeper into how they tried to use wrestling to alter the very fabric of reality, we need to quickly understand who these people are and why exactly they'd want this. Fifthists are a decentralized, quasi-religious cause united by such strange and vague concepts as fate, predestination, manifestation, symbols, signs, patterns. They're Semiticians and hippies, reality warpers and monks. People who seek to understand the base patterns that dictate the ebb and flow of the universe, and people hoping to throw those same patterns out of the window and rewrite them completely. If you're dealing with the Fifthists, they might be trying to help, harm, or just try something out. But one thing is absolutely certain. They'll either be trying to break some fundamental law of the universe, or exploit one of those same laws. They think that intent, knowledge, and belief is powerful, and a place where all of these overlap is the surreal domain of professional wrestling. Which brings us back to the era of Bonatti, where they adopted the old vaudeville principle of kayfabe. This is the unspoken agreement between wrestlers, promotions, and fans to act as though everything they're seeing in and outside of the rings is real and unplanned, even if they know that they aren't. This element of performance is vital, because actual tests of athletic prowess, like Olympic wrestling, simply won't work for this particular fittest ritual. And that ritual's name is a light without shadow. In order for this ritual to come into fruition, a number of other strange and specific conditions also need to be met. The match must take place between a face and a heel, but not just any face and heel. It must be a face and heel who have been in an unbroken kayfabe feud for at least 6 months. A light without shadow will only manifest during some kind of special match devised to be the climactic battle of the feud, such as a lights-out Iron Man match, electric barbed wire death match, flaming graveyard match, etc. And only if this fight is broadcast to a simultaneous collective group of 150,000 people. And if the ritual is conducted effectively, it will often lead to the death of one or both wrestlers involved. But why? What actually happens if a light without shadow is completed? And what does conducting the ritual actually look like in practice? To know the answer to that, we need to take a look at the most infamous example. And this was the example that the two Foundation agents explained to Vince McMahon on that fateful day in the early 1980s. It was the 1979 Xtreme Deathmatch between Val Valiant and Eddie Carnage, a fight that everyone in attendance probably never would have forgotten, were it not for the anomalous effects of SCP-6037. Valiant and Carnage were mortal enemies in the ring, two men who would burn down the whole world if it meant just getting to burn each other. They'd had some of the most brutal fights ever seen in their Southwest American promotion. They seemed to take turns leaving the ring on a stretcher, bloodied and bashed. They were widely known in the wrestling community as a pair of the most brutal fighters in modern history, especially when it came to fighting each other. It was long believed that if any two wrestlers were inevitably going to murder each other in the ring, it would be one of them. And that was exactly what the closing match of their feud was marketed on. Tune in, because you might just see a man really die on television tonight. On one side of the ring, there was Val Valiant, the buff, blonde, all-American babyface. He was a lovable hero who fought for truth, justice, and the American way, no matter what. But sadly, even heroes aren't exempt from the ravages of time. Val, in his early 60s, was in the twilight of his career. He moved slower than he used to, fought with less energy, and took longer to recover from injuries. For many of his most ardent fans, there was speculation that the Xtreme Deathmatch with Eddie would be his last fight, whether it was due to retiring from wrestling or from life itself. Then there was Eddie Carnage, 20 years younger than his mortal enemy. He was a monster heel whose reign of terror over the wrestlers on his circuit only met an end at the righteous wall of Val Valiant. Since then, Carnage had made it his life's purpose to take the hero of Southwest Wrestling and drag him through the mud, destroying him in front of the fans who looked to him for inspiration and hope. It wasn't enough to just defeat the man. He wanted to break and humiliate him. Sparks would fly and blood would stain the canvas at the fight, and it was only a few days away. Fans were buzzing to see if good or evil would triumph in this battle of titans. But as is always the case in the complicated blended realities of wrestling, the truth was much more complicated than the storyline. Val Valiant's real name was John Walsh, and Eddie Carnage was actually Rory Greer, and the men had been friends for around 15 years. John, as the senior wrestler, had taken Rory under his wing when he'd first entered the wrestling world. He gave the younger man advice about succeeding in the industry, and had protected him from negative influences. He even helped him create his Dynamite Eddie Carnage persona. With the ultimate fight on the horizon, John had his legacy as Val Valiant to think about, and Rory, despite Eddie Carnage being on the rise, wanted to give his mentor and friend a respectful send-off, befitting of everything that the man had done for him. One thing was understood equally between them. To make this fight everything it needed to be, Valiant and Carnage needed to leave everything on the mat and not hold back one iota of violence up there in the squared circle. But nobody had any idea of just how insane this climactic fight would become. A packed crowd was forced into the 20,000-seat arena where the two would be facing off for the last time. They were screaming and hollering in support of their hero and decrying the black-hearted villain. But these reactions exploded when the two wrestlers began their march down the aisles, their entrance music blaring in the background. In the center of the ring, referee Jessica Powers prepared to force the two bloodthirsty brutes apart. But when they climbed into the squared circle, it was clear that this wouldn't be a normal fight. Eddie Carnage reached off the side of the ring and brought up a light tube, a classic heel weapon in deathmatch-style fights. He smashed it over Valiant's head, showering down a glowing cascade of glass from the hero's face. As the crowd booed and jeered, the referee tried to intervene, but that didn't go well. Carnage tossed her aside, her head slamming against the turnbuckle, seemingly knocking her out cold. The fight was going off-road. Across the territory and the further United States, people were tuning in to see how it would shake out, and the intensity of the fight ramped up and up. Valiant had regained his footing, knocking Eddie off of his rhythm with a series of well-timed strikes and locks. Somehow they didn't seem like they were acting out on some agreed-upon choreographed dance of martial prowess. They were really starting to kill each other, and it wasn't just the fighters that were changing, it was the arena itself. Somehow the size of the stands had increased, going from a 20,000 capacity arena to one that seated easily 40,000. And little by little, these seats were filled by people who weren't quite entirely human. Yet nobody in the original audience even seemed to notice the bizarre shifting of the dimensions of the building, or the new audience members who had just manifested around them. They were too enraptured in the fight itself. Back in the ring, the violence was explosive. They seemed less like men and more like violent demons, their physical forms twisting and shifting as they unleashed their fury onto each other. Elsewhere, the seated arenas kept expanding, and more extra-dimensional freaks started appearing in the audience. The fight went on for an utterly vicious hour, culminating in Val Valiant, who had truly given the fight of his life, splayed out across the canvas. The monstrous Eddie Carnage punched him over and over and over, until the aged wrestler's movements ceased entirely. It seemed that the man was dead, and a light without a shadow was about to be fulfilled. A pale light emerged from the body of both wrestlers. A blue light descended rapidly towards the ring, meeting the rising light. The lights collided mid-air, and in that instant, the entire arena was fully illuminated. Approximately 2 meters above the ring, the wind began to howl with the opening of a portal, causing a severe loss of integrity to baseline reality and physical structural support of the arena. Following the conclusion of the event, the referee, the announcers, and members of the crowd were unable to recall the anomalous aspects of the match. There was a breakdown in baseline reality of the area over the next 18 to 36 months, along with statistically significant increases in arson, assault, and fraud charges among members of the audience. There was even a spike in non-traditional religious organizations, Ponzi schemes, fan clubs, and other affinity groups within the affected area. After the fight, agents from the SCP Foundation spoke to Rory Greer, aka Eddie Carnage, in the locker room where he was toweling off. In contrast to everyone else in attendance, he seemed aware of what had happened in the ring, and yet he wasn't happy. He confessed that they'd been contacted by a Fifthist missionary before the fight and were actively recruited into participating in the Light Without Shadow ritual. When he asked why, he had his answer. That transcendent match was the fight that Valiant deserved as a send-off, even though he knew he wouldn't survive the process. Such was his devotion to the craft of wrestling. But while Valiant was dead, he wasn't the only one who'd lost something. The ritual necessitated a sacrifice, something realer than a sole human being, something that existed in the minds of so many, the Eddie Carnage persona. It had been taken from the psychosphere itself. Never again would it be considered a viable identity in the wrestling world. Rory may not have died, but he still lost his whole life. You really can't have a ritual like this without a sacrifice. Having heard the whole story, 2 representatives of the SCP Foundation stood at the desk of Vince McMahon, who, in a surprising turn for him, didn't say a word during the entire spiel. He just listened intently and occasionally nodded, taking in the deranged tale of a wrestling match that nearly ended the known universe. "So," one of the representatives cautiously asked, "what do you think?" Vince McMahon smiled. "Gentlemen," he said, "welcome to the wrestling business. Want to see the epic matchups on the rest of the card? Check out Insane SCP-001 Fight, Gate Guardian vs. Scarlet King, and SCP-049 Fights, SCP-343 is the referee, Dr. Bright starts a fight club. For more,